In 1986, the father of a very young Markus Persson would bring home a Commodore 128. This mid-range PC contained a staggering 0.1 megabytes of memory, and had a simple UI prompting you to input commands. Now, it is important to remember that personal computing in the 80s was niche. I mean, the internet didn't even really exist, while Windows was, well, Windows. Despite this, video games were incredibly popular on the Commodore, and Persson would spend more than his fair share of hours in the Bard's Tale or Raid on Bungling Bay. However, the birth of his passion for game development and programming would not be found here, but instead in these old magazines. Alongside news and discussion around tech, many subscriptions came with software that could range anywhere from tax filing programs to simple time-killing minigames. There was an issue though. These apps couldn't really be shared on a floppy disk, and there was no digital cloud. Instead, they printed out pages and pages of code where you'd be forced to painstakingly type in every single letter, number, and special character, all for something that would only keep your attention for a couple of minutes. For Markus and so many others though, the enjoyment came from the process. After making mistakes while coding, he realized it changed the end product in seemingly unpredictable ways. A color would be off, a weird bug popped up, or it might just crash instantly. This led to a deep fascination with figuring out how it worked. Coding was sorta like Legos, and maybe a replacement for the Swedes. You could follow the instructions exactly to build something neat but pre-designed, or take your own path and slowly piece together something of your own. It'll probably suck, especially at first, but from trial and error, you'd eventually learn that this mangled, indecipherable mess was an entire language of its own. A year later, Persson, at the age of just 8, created his first game. It was a western text adventure where you had to perform the right actions or else you'd fall off a cliff, or lose in some other kind of way. He never thought to give it a name, nor even knew how to save programs. So once the computer shut off, it was gone forever. In many ways, this early behavior would carry on with him, and he grew to seemingly love developing software in a semi-transient state, often with many bugs and sloppily written code, in mediums that can be easily lost to time. This is the story of how Notch came to be. Despite this passion for making games early on, Markus didn't immediately consider it as a career path. He was a kid after all. I'm sure many of you wanted to be firefighters or astronauts, but didn't realize you could make way more money as a reaction streamer or snake oil salesman. It didn't help that anytime he expressed interest in developing video games professionally, his teachers and counselors would scoff. That industry was volatile, high stress, and probably just a fad anyways. This was the mid-90s. Every company wanted to get in on the World Wide Web, so information technologies was where it's at. With seemingly countless jobs popping up, that's what he decided to go for, spending the last couple of years in school learning how to pirate Adobe and make web pages. Luckily, in today's world, it's far easier to make a beautiful and engaging website without getting a formal education. What? Were you expecting something? Regardless, Persson wouldn't give up on his hobby just yet. He'd set up his first game studio, even registering a name for it so you know it's official. If we're gonna be honest though, calling Bit 7 Productions a studio is... well, it was more like a testing ground that consisted of half-baked ideas with little known about them besides a couple screenshots. He'd spend time working on anything from side-scrollers to this weird ball game, a platformer that had guns, and a Mega Man clone with a weird furry. One of the first real attempts at a game was Rubylands, an RPG where you could fight ugly birds, but then he got bored and made Rubylands XL, which would have been a roguelike with a cool lighting engine. But then he got bored of that, and so on and so forth. The Rubylands prefix quickly became a placeholder name for a bunch of projects, but it's hard to know how much potential any of these really had. However, the end of the 20th century approached, and it would soon be time for Markus to move on and begin his career in IT. He sold the domain name to some guy who turned it into a weird service for Y2K. Then he landed a job at a web design company, giving up his professional ambition for game development. So, I guess that's the end of the video. Wait, why is there still 25 minutes left? Well, while Y2K didn't cause planes to fall out of the sky or power grids to collapse, it did Y2 kill Persson's career after investors realized that maybe you shouldn't drop $6 billion on a website that lets you listen to basketball games. Once this 200 IQ revelation was made, the dot-com bubble burst, and suddenly companies all over were going bankrupt and laying off thousands. Thankfully, stockholders learned their lesson and made sure this would never happen again. But Markus would be out of a job for several years and forced to move back in with his mom. As frustrating as this was, it did give him time to reevaluate what to do in life, and he'd soon follow his dream to be a part of the video game industry. During this period of unemployment, Persson spent a lot more time on the internet, usually hanging out in forums and IRCs related to the resurgent indie game movement. He'd also set up his own website, theinterclinic.com, which was basically just a couple hyperlinks to the stuff he was working on. In particular, a small selection of music he made under the alias Markus Alexei, which we now know is just his middle name. Or is it? You can hear it playing in the background, and it's kinda neat. It seems like he was inspired by EDM musicians like Aphex Twin and Ateker. Gonna be real with y'all, I know nothing about music, and my source is this Reddit post. Pursuing game development finally paid off when Persson got hired by a company called Game Federation. While he hasn't said much about it, I managed to find their website with the Wayback Machine, but it's just a bunch of yapping about how their technology was going to revolutionize the gamer world. I think their goal was to make online games seamlessly work on multiple devices in 2002. It won't surprise you that they went out of business a few years later, and they might not have even made any games. At least it was work though, and it would be here that Markus met someone who would soon become a very close friend. Rolf Jansen had a pretty similar upbringing to Persson. His father worked in tech, leading him to develop an interest in computers at a young age. Co-workers at Game Federation, they shared their personal pet projects. Markus wanted to develop a fantasy world set within dense forests, while Rolf had created a test server for a Western strategy game. They worked well with one another, and soon decided to combine the two ideas they had, laying the groundwork for something big. Since Bit 7 had already been sold, they needed to set up a new studio to represent the game, so Persson sketched out a rough logo and reused the name the two came up with while playing EVE Online.
Warp off, and 4OK.
Mojang. Well, technically Mojang specifications. Not even gonna lie though, this logo looks pretty good. Next, they need to be careful. With a lack of funding and lagging experience making full-fledged, commercially viable games, they'd want to temper their ambitions and not bite off more than they could chew. Sensibly, they were going to make a MMORPG.
A player logs in. His name is Naughty. He finds himself on a shore, clothing tattered and wet. The wreckage of his ship looms out to sea while the forest beckons inland. He notices smoke rising above the tree line and begins to make his way through the forest, cautiously closing in on the source. His attempt to stay hidden is short-lived, however. He trips and falls into the clearing, where he finds a man chopping wood, who briefly pauses before simply nodding. Naughty, relieved to have found civilization, makes his way into the settlement, where he's introduced to the mayor, who gives him a tour of the humble abodes and various amenities. He learns that several of their hunters have recently gone off to war and is offered to take their place. Naughty agrees and is ceremoniously welcomed into Shura village before dusk, then given a bow, a quiver of arrows, and some leather armor. A few weeks into the game, Naughty has become accustomed to the life of a hunter, beginning with lumbering, slow prey to more nimble and elusive creatures. Butchering the animals where they fall, the saddlebags of his horse are filled with meat and valuable hides, often making his way up to a neighboring village nestled in the mountains to trade them for iron and gold. Naughty grew fond of traveling, venturing into the depths of the island. He searched through dilapidated ruins, strode through beautiful landscapes, and skulked past dormant horrors best not provoked. As time passed and seasons changed, Naughty began to run out of new adventures to have on his island home. While he did learn how to forge better weapons and armor, there just wasn't much action. Occasionally a few goblins would kill livestock or try to steal from a few unaware villagers, but they proved to be little challenged now. Naughty pondered quitting, until hearing from a traveler that a league of peaceful settlements across the sea had recently suffered a crushing defeat against a belligerent kingdom, eager to force their will on all others on that server. This was a land of constant strife, plagued with formidable beasts and the most treacherous players. At that moment, he had a new goal. Naughty said goodbye to the villagers of Shura and made his way to the port city of Chitas, then hopped on the first vessel that would take him to the embattled island in pursuit of gold and glory. This is the story of just one player in a game of thousands, who will build every town, pave every road, mine every piece of ore, forge every weapon, and shape the very land around them. This is Worm Online.
That was an adaptation of the original concept outlining Rolf Jansen and Markus Persson's passion project. They were going to make a massively online multiplayer role-playing sandbox that was almost entirely player-driven, where even the ground could be dug up and sculpted to their liking. You'd be on your own to explore the Isles of Wurm, lacking any built-in quest lines, towns, or NPCs. With no rules to follow, this adventure would be up to you. To say these two were in over their heads would be an understatement. To my knowledge, nothing like this had yet been made on the scale they were imagining. Not to mention, the cost to develop and maintain MMORPGs were and still are the most expensive of any game genre. When you consider the lack of accessibility for indie studios in the early 2000s, and the size and expertise required of the development team, this might not seem possible. Yet, if you log onto Steam, you'll see Worm Online is still around as of this video, with a small, albeit rapidly dedicated community. So that begs the question, how in the world did they pull this off? When developing a fantasy MMORPG, there are quite a few things you need. An engaging skill tree, well-designed settlements, compelling questlines, vast, interesting worlds with deep lore, thousands of assets, models, and textures, alongside a game engine and server that can support hundreds of people online at any given time. Now, thanks to Worm's unique position, corners can be cut. The story, lore, and NPC towns would immediately be defenestrated, while you could get very creative with how a limited pool of assets are used. An engine to handle this game would be one of the greatest hurdles, but these two had a big brain idea: use Java. While inferior languages like C++ or Python require optimization to run, Java can be kinda just forced into existence against its will. Now, while the end product does work, don't look at the code, or all the bugs, or the 5 frames per second on a game that should be able to run on a calculator. Anyways, if you just unpause this video after writing a 5-paragraph long comment explaining how and why I'm wrong, no, I don't know anything about programming, and you cannot make me learn. Okay, so that leaves us with the server backend, which Rolf was most experienced with, and the actual world itself, that Markus would end up focusing on. But, to be clear, they did spend most of their time working together and compromising wherever necessary. For this video though, we're just gonna hone in on how Persson designed the world with an extremely promising, but often problematic technology: procedural generation. In order to create an open world game, you are normally forced to hire developers and artists that draw a layout of the world, figure out where everything should be, then make them go through and manually place every single house, tree, bush, rock, etc. This takes a lot of time to make, severely limits the game's scope, and can end up with landscapes feeling artificial or cause proportions to not look right. But what if you could just have a computer do all this for you? Explained as simply as possible, procedural generation uses random number generators to create data. In this case, that means far faster development of far larger worlds. One of the most impressive examples, Elite 2 Frontier, rendered an entire galaxy, had 30,000 inhabited planets you could seamlessly land on from space, and a realistic physics engine in 1992. Yeah, you can go make fun of Starfield. There is a problem though. While CPUs are exceptional at following and repeating specific orders, they aren't so great at creating their own unique, well, anything on their own. Bethesda's Daggerfall was the size of Wyoming but almost as empty, while Skyrim's Radiant quests were horrendously boring. I've never actually played the Elder Scrolls though, so you can ignore my surface level criticisms if you want to defend a publisher that still uses a 30-year-old game engine. Persson, having been interested in this technology for years, wanted to try using it, and after creating several islands we'd finally get our first look at Wurm. While the graphics are very rough, the landscapes do look pretty good, to me at least. An interesting consequence of this was that Persson and Jansen didn't really know where anything was. Thankfully, we can now see the various islands of Wurm in all of their glory, but those first few years must have made travel interesting. Wurm Online would launch as a free alpha to the public in late 2003. The first generation of players would enter the game, and in many ways become part of the development process themselves. It was these players, after all, who laid the literal groundwork for everything that would come. So it would be imperative that Mojang communicate well with their community. Perhaps it's no wonder then that it would be here in the forums that Persson began to be known primarily by his username, Notch. Now, as much as I'd like to, and probably should dig deeper into this part of Wurm's history, I don't have the time or energy to give it justice. So I focused on the aspect most important to the series. But hey, if you're an aspiring YouTuber, I haven't really seen anyone cover this topic yet. After around 4 years of development, Wurm Online would technically release on June 6, 2006, or February 11th, or June 1st, and Mojang began charging $5 a month to play the game. This was a pretty obscure release, as there didn't seem to be any publications talking about it at the time, though there's a chance it's because of link decay. Regardless, this game had really become something. There were a few thousand total users, with around 100 people online at any given time. Many of the promised features had been implemented, from landscaping, animal husbandry and building, to enchanting, a complex combat system, and apparently notorious giant spiders. Towns popped up all around, kingdoms formed, wars were waged, and countless stories had already been told. The dream of two inexperienced developers became a reality. Markus Persson and Rolf Jansen managed to pull off something truly incredible. Or had they? You know how I said technically released instead of officially? Well, I've brought up the mechanics, the aspirations, everything you can do, but not how you do it. The gameplay is bad. Like, really, really bad. There isn't a whole lot I could say that wouldn't just be rehashing what Josh Strife brought up in his video, going over the many design decisions that push people away from Wurm. But the biggest problem to me, at least, is it feels almost like a text RPG that's been mangled and forcibly stretched out to be in the third person. Everything aside from walking requires you to press a special on-screen button, hidden within like 30 different menus. Whether you're digging dirt, fighting a player, or building a house, it'll be horribly overcomplicated and really puts the micro in microgymming. Some people love games that require a wiki to do anything, but I feel like there might be a problem when you have to have a dedicated key that opens up the Wurmpedia. However, I don't want to harp on this too much or seem overly negative. It's still a game that deeply fascinates me as a concept, and it scratches an itch for a niche group of people. If you like gritty, unforgiving sandboxes that give you no direction or set path, I'd recommend checking it out. But personally, my interest to play the game ended after I was eaten by a crocodile, because I couldn't figure out how to fight it, and I'd wager that's where most others leave. It should also be mentioned that if this isn't your cup of tea, please don't attack or brigade the community. While it's still quite small, they seem pretty welcoming and just want to enjoy their game. For Notch though, the honeymoon phase after release was over by 2007 as issues arose. The workflow between Rolf and him had schismed, leading to more and more arguments over where they wanted to take Wurm. With the partnership starting to fracture, they decided to slice up various sections of the game and work separately. While Persson continued to work on the client, Jansen, perhaps by accident, ended up with creative control over many of the mechanics that players directly interacted with. This led to Notch feeling drained of the passion he had, and not wanting to strain his friendship further by forcing himself back into the fray, he opted to step away and stop working on the game entirely. Rolf, in a show of good faith, let Markus keep the name of the company, rebranding to 1-2-Free not long after. While this departure caused a lot of confusion in the community, his involvement with the game faded away over time, eventually becoming but a minor footnote in its history. However, Persson's professional life carried on throughout this entire period. His time with Game Federation, though, would be short-lived after a small, Swedish startup gave him an offer he couldn't refuse.
Hi, my name is Rolf Jansson. I'm the CEO of 123AB that develops Worm Online. This is a message to the 4chan users that are basically invading our game.
Meet Riccardo Zacconi, some random Italian guy, and Toby Rowland, the wealthy son of an apartheid-era mining tycoon. Yikes. Regardless, these guys aren't really that important, so instead of doing actual research, I'm giving them the Sunny V2 treatment. Veterans of the dot-com bubble, they worked together for an online dating company that would be sold off in early 2003. With a nice severance, these two decided to start their own company, Midas player. Having seen the explosive popularity of online flash games, Riccardo and Toby saw huge potential for monetization, leading them to set up a studio in Stockholm and launch a website where players could pay to compete against each other for small pools of money. While that might sound like gambling, they were sure to mention many times that it totally wasn't. No, instead, this was skill gaming, and they simply took a cut of each payment. Unfortunately, the initial launch didn't go too smoothly, as they were unable to make a profit. I guess not enough people were willing to pay for this experience. With the new year approaching and bankruptcy looming ahead, the end seemed near for Midas Player, until the founder's old CEO decided to give the company $20 million on Christmas Eve, which is one heck of a present. With this new influx of money, they'd hire a certain Markus A. Persson, rebrand to King.com, and spew out these awful ads.
I want 20p! You'll have a blast however much you win at King.com.
This effort seemingly paid off though, and use of the website skyrocketed, allowing for the rapid expansion of their skill gaming business. In an article I didn't save for reasons only past me would know, Persson worked on over 30 of the various games that would be hosted on the site, from pinball, which is just pinball, to a simple flash game where you lead a little duck around with your cursor to catch flowers, as well as ports of Luxor and Zuma, which, if you grew up in the early 2000s, you might have some really obscure and weird memories of. Finally, there was a few others he said were too shameful to claim as his own. I wonder what those could be. Honestly, these were incredibly mediocre flash games pumped out every other month to get children addicted to gambling. And Markus knew it. There was no passion or love put into any of them, and while it was probably demotivating, the pay was decent and they allowed him to work on what he really cared about. For some reason, I feel like I should transition this to a shill for my Patreon, but instead I'll just pretend this isn't a call to action by being annoyingly meta about it. Game jams. You might know them, you might not. But they're essentially just competitions where programmers attempt to make a game with a certain theme, usually in the span of just a few days. Notch personally participated in a ton of Java 4K competitions, where you were challenged to make an entire game with just 4 kilobytes of memory. For comparison, that's 6 times smaller than the original Pac-Man. I won't go through all his games in detail as they're all pretty inconsequential, but it's interesting seeing Persson go from developing a bare-bones racer with stolen sprites in 2005 to a dungeon crawler, first-person shooter, mining simulator, and eventually a full-on RTS by the end of 2007. While Miners 4K and T4KNS managed to win first and third place in their respective years, the size of the competition was as small as the games themselves, which meant that they didn't really pick up any attention outside of small circles. Coincidentally though, it would be around this time that a failed dating website rebranded to become a video streaming platform that anyone could upload to. Overnight, the way the internet communicated drastically changed, and gave small, independent creators the opportunity to be seen by millions. If I had a nickel for every time I mentioned a dating website in a video about a Swedish programmer, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. In August 2008, Notch released Breaking the Tower for Ludum Dare, another game jam that was becoming increasingly popular with a greater focus on the time constraints. It was an isometric strategy game where you'd build up a tribe on an island to eventually tear down a giant stone tower. The catch is it's slow, incredibly slow. It can take hours or days to beat the game, but for whatever reason this seemingly attracted people. A few YouTube videos popped up reviewing or showing off users' time lapses, which went on to receive tens of thousands of views. A journalist for Rock Paper Shotgun even made an article about it, which as far as I can tell, one of the first times a major media publication ever talked about a game Persson made. A few months later, he released a top-down Left 4 Dead clone for Java 4K, where you stumble your way through homes and alleyways in the dark while being chased by hundreds of zombies. This managed to win first place, garner more views on YouTube, and even managed to get a mention from Kotaku before that was considered an insult. This was a welcome surprise to him, but behind the scenes, Notch was cooking something far more substantial, and it would be an entire decade in the making. Back during the Bit 7 days, Markus made this, a 2.5D engine he had created to mimic its softwares. If you don't know what 2.5D is, just add 0.5 to 2. Got it? Okay. Now, while it was originally intended to just be a test, he ended up having a lot of fun working on and building upon it. This led to Rubyland's All Caps, an attempt at an RPG that boasted variable movement, which most likely worked in a similar way to the original Doom. There's also a fire and inventory texture that looks strikingly similar to... well, regardless, Persson had a rough idea of what he wanted to do by 2001. Officially titled Legend of the Chambered, he set out to develop a retro-style dungeon crawler that would improve on many of the gameplay mechanics originally pioneered by Dungeon Master. It was released on the Interclinic website with an explanation of some of its features. Unfortunately though, the game itself is currently lost media, so not a whole lot can be said about it, relegating it to being just another in the massive pile of half-baked ideas left in that folder you're totally gonna get around to finishing one day. This was the end of Legend of the Chambered.
Until it wasn't.
Wait, I've used this bit before. Darn. Well, by 2008, Notch got the urge to work on the game again. He released a demo on the Java gaming forums in August, and later dumped a second level with a lot more content. You can really tell it's one of the more refined projects he worked on. The movement feels great, and the way the inventory system works is interesting and intuitive. The level design is lackluster, and the combat's basic, but I guess it could be far worse. I'm sure you've noticed the visual style resembles a more popular game he'd later work on, and the reason for that is kinda neat. Persson wanted to force himself to draw all of the textures as needed in Paint, opposed to using placeholders. While it can be a little messy at times, it gives LOC a cozy, classic feel. Notch would go on to release many more versions of Chambered, but none of them ever really panned out, and he'd eventually lose interest, casting it back into that folder to never be seen again.
Oh shit, here we go again.
The 2.5D engine was a bust, and having spent so much time working on 2D Flash games, Persson now wanted to use the experience gained from Worm to create his own 3D engine. But there was an issue. Over the last 5 years, King.com had grown from a small business with 8 employees to a multi-million-dollar company hiring over 100 people. A corporate structure was quickly forming, and with corporate comes I meant they were becoming increasingly concerned with their employees pursuing their own commercial endeavors. With smartphone app stores growing in popularity and King looking to jump off the sinking ship that was skill gambling, Notch would soon face the decision to either give up his indie ambitions and spend the next 20 years programming predatory mobile games that obliterate the attention spans of 6 and 60-year-olds, or take a risk, maintain his integrity, and walk the path few had yet taken. This decision would be difficult, but Markus knew he couldn't work for a large, soulless corporation, so he came up with a plan. First, he'd find a new job that wouldn't mind his transient nature. Then he'd spend half a year to create a game that could optimistically make a few $1,000s. If he was extraordinarily lucky, he could even become a full-time indie developer eventually. Notch had no clue at the time, but those 6 short months would drag on for over 5 long years.